I was kind of trying to grapple with the question in the email about what we might talk about, and what I kind of realized is that I wasn't coming up with much of anything. But I also was realizing that the prior conversation we had, I think, it was a little bit freewheeling, and it kind of went in undefined directions and made me step back and realize that, or ask the question of what it is about Kierkegaard that, that's meaningful to me. How did that happen? And how is that the case for me, that Kierkegaard, has this special place? And I was trying to describe that a minute ago, but wanting maybe each of us to contribute. How is that? How did Kierkegaard become an important figure, and in what way, or how would you speak to the way in which Kierkegaard is an important figure? And kind of for me, I was realizing, I've kind of created this set of ideas that to some degree I've lifted from Kierkegaard. To some degree I realize I've put my own self into that, and a lot of those ideas, which I've got pretty clear sense for, may not actually be a correct interpretation of Kierkegaard, and yet I still kind of cherish them as having come from this experience that I had originally confronting Kierkegaard, particularly Fear and Trembling. So I don't know if that.
Yeah. I mean, one thought I have straight out is just I personally almost feel, at least when I'm personally reading Kierkegaard, I sometimes wonder if there's actually, if it's a bit futile to sort of try to interpret Kierkegaard correctly. And I think what Kierkegaard tries to do in you is just have exactly what you described here, this encounter between you and the text, which just stirs this new, brings into being this new way of thinking, where it's much less about, what does Kierkegaard think about faith or truth or existence or what have you. I think what he wants to do instead, and that's the reason why his texts are so ambiguous and so complex, is because what he really wants to do is to confront the single reader and to bring about a change in you. And I think that's what's happened to all three of us through reading Kierkegaard. And I don't know if it's all that important to what degree we're interpreting him correctly, though it does seem that people who read Kierkegaard sort of, they do sort of seem to gravitate towards a certain way of thinking or towards certain ideas, or there's just something different about the types of people an encounter with Kierkegaard brings into the world. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. I would push back a little bit on that, in the sense, obviously he is trying to say something, especially in particular books like The Sickness of the Death is a good example of that. He was conflicted himself when he wrote that, because he after he finished, he thought to himself, well, he wrote it somewhere too, in his journals, that he couldn't put his own name on it. He had to put this ideal Christian's name on that book. So obviously he thinks that he is saying the most true things there, but he can't live them himself. So he has to put it on this other name. And but yeah, you are that again, you are still right that he wants you to think along particular lines, or he wants you to get to a place where you are thinking in a particular way rather than believing particular things.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's obviously the case for Fear and Trembling, which is an excellent book, because you're basically taken along on this ride where this guy's just doing a thought experiment over and over again, right? He's trying to figure out what faith is. Turns out he's trying to do it in the wrong way, but yet again, you are basically led along to think to think along particular lines, or do this thought experiment with him. And there's many books that do similar things. Even some of his homilies, his sermons.
Oh, yeah.
He calls them discourses. They're similar to that too. It's like a
Socratic.
It feels like a what would you call that? A stream of consciousness type thing, right? Where he's just kind of thinking and he's taking you along for the ride. So I really like that about him.
Yeah. I recently read a biography of Kierkegaard. I always forget what this woman's last name was. It was Clary
Carlyle?
I think that's right. I think it was Clary Carlyle or something. Really good biography. And what I really got out of what her biography, she sort of wrote it in this interesting internal style where she seemed to be relying very heavily on his journals and notebooks. And it was much less focused on sort of the external events, for example, describing how his relationship with Regina, what the actual events were. What she much rather did was sort of focus in on his internal experience. And you sort of got this sense of a guy who is just lives in this extreme state of inner turmoil and inner tension. And you could see him constantly sort of being flung back and forth between extremes and sort of thinking about this idea and never and having a very hard time coming to a resolution. Just a guy always torn between tensions. And one of the key tensions she explores is, I think this comes up in Fear and Trembling as well, is, the difference between the monk and the Knight of Faith, I think, where, it's Kierkegaard sort of has this thing throughout his career where he's wondering whether he should just give up his whole authorship. And he has this little vision of himself retiring to a countryside parish and sort of living his life out in peace. And so it's this tension between living this monkish existence out in the countryside and this confrontation with Christendom reintroducing Christianity into Christendom, which he does through his authorship. One is sort of a withdrawal from the world, and the other is a living within the world and trying to to be faithful and also to truly exist. The in Fear and Trembling you have this Knight of Faith and this Knight of Infinite Resignation. The Knight of Faith is this guy who just happily walks home and eats his dinner, while the Knight of Infinite Resignation gives up what is of greatest value to him, but doesn't believe he's ever going to get it back. So I just got this sense of this guy who's really, really always in tension. And I think that's one thing I also picked up from Kierkegaard, just reading him, is being much more comfortable with tension, with paradox, and with not coming to too hasty conclusions, and much rather sort of exploring how the tension between two opposing ideas or things can open up new possibilities. So I think that's one. Just this living with tension is something I've picked up from Kierkegaard as well. Jim?
Yeah, this kind of goes to partly this idea I started with, which is that I've not studied Kierkegaard as broadly as I maybe should have. And I kind of have the sketch of his biography but I've never read one of his biographies. I really was in a kind of deep dive on Fear and Trembling, and have read Sickness Unto Death and Either Or, but didn't quite think I gathered what was going on with Either Or when I read it, and haven't gotten back to it. And so, so I think I have this, this idea of Kierkegaard, which I've just made up from that. A little bit of what you're talking about there, what I think about when I think about Kierkegaard is a guy who maybe I've bumped into people like this, young people who you're talking to them and a little kind of wildness that might actually do the stuff that they're formulating in ideas. They have committed ideas about something, like this is the way the world is. I want to be an artist and I'm going to give up everything and go into the woods and paint these paintings because they're the most meaningful things in the world. And you worry a little bit about that they might actually do it, and to some degree, Kierkegaard feels like that to me. He's a guy who kind of did that, or maybe he didn't. You were talking about this tension. He stayed in Christendom and he wanted to be upset with all the Christians around him, so he didn't really want to go off. But maybe, but then he kind of commits in a way that undoes this relationship that he has, which feels kind of wrong, or feels like that's one of those things of taking a bit too seriously these ideas. Then you see that in the work, because that's kind of what he's at least for me, this is one of these central ideas I've pulled out of him, which is, you're stuck in that situation no matter what. That is, so you can have these ideas and have this passion and ultimately decide you can't do that. You're going to compromise to life's exigencies. But even that is the same kind of commitment. You're committing to that. And everything you're doing is committing in this real way that it doesn't matter if you think you're doing something, kind of sensible, or if it's all the same deal. We're all facing, the future, which ultimately we're creating by our decisions. And so in that sense of his biography, and in that sense in his writing of that kind of little bit wild-eyed urgency, that adds to the sense of the meaning of the, because it gives you that sense that sense of the realness and power.
Yeah, I mean, the example of Regina is just such a good example here.
Yeah.
I think of this passage from Either Or. It's the most famous quote from Either Or. I haven't read the book, but I probably should. Where one of the authors says, if you get married, you'll regret it. If you don't get married, you'll regret it. It's all the same. And I think that's exactly what with Kierkegaard, what's going on with Regina, where he probably realizes, if I get married to this lady, I won't be able to pursue this deep vocation I feel I should pursue. I won't be able to pursue this life of writing, this life of suffering that he seems intent on living out. And at the same time, if you read the biography, he's obviously tormented for the rest of his life by the decision he made not to marry Regina. So she continues to pop up in his writings. He has these heartbreaking encounters with her in the street, where she'll look at him, 10 years after the fact. He'll get this glance at her from across the street, and then he'll just spend pages and pages in his notebooks agonizing over what this glance could have meant. And it's just exactly that's exactly the tension, right? Do you make this great sacrifice and suffer because of it, or do you suffer because you've decided not to make that decision. Yeah.
And so that's, and so that we're in that situation one way or the other. And then that whole dynamic of his biography, and that, which I don't know in great detail, but I kind of know that part of the story, of course, resonates in the text. When you're reading it, you're feeling that urgency, and that then is part of that sense that he allows for in some way, based on all the different things, the craftiness with language, the construction using the pseudonyms, the things that he chooses to write about, all come together with that sense of urgency, which then gives you this sense of it's important. It can be important. You can see that it's real, that it's going to have impact. And then you can go back to, like we talked about originally, you can go to the text of the Bible and say, oh, this is a story, but it's not just a story. It's touching on the real thing that we're all going through. And being able to kind of generate that kind of energy is one of the things that I really have taken from Kierkegaard in my.
Yeah. Okay. I think that opens up a new dimension of the story you were describing with your encounter with Kierkegaard, where you were saying you're coming from the secular background, and Kierkegaard sort of gives you this way of approaching Christianity that's deep and profound. Right. And I wonder if that's sort of what you experienced, as Kierkegaard manages to transform Christianity from just this set of ideas or stories that you can just dispassionately read about into this passionate lived existence that has a genuine impact on your life, and it is something you can enter into. Does that sort of
exactly the way I feel about it?
Okay. Wow. Yeah. I think that. Yeah.
Robert, what do you think about that whole dialogue that we just had? Because you're the expert here, right? You're the
expert, right?
I'm pinning you with that. I'm making you play that role.
So say again just like sum up how you what it means to you, or how it reveals to you your own Christianity, or how did you say that?
Oh yeah, Robert was missing the earlier part here. Yeah.
Well, just the way Julian just put it. Well, I think I tried to put it, describe it a minute ago with this sense that I see this personality of Kierkegaard as having this kind of intensity, and he takes things a bit too seriously in his personal life, and he's making these kind of committed decisions, and knowing that little scenario about his biography makes me think about the text in a different way, and then it adds into the text, and I don't know. I think he's that's actually part of the construction as well. He has a sort of self-awareness about him that I'm pretty sure he might have hated it in a way. But it was there anyways, and he used it. So fear and trembling is obviously a version of his own story with Regina, basically.
Oh yeah.
He's definitely, it's not even subtle, right? It's there. And he says in his journals at one point, and he must have known his journals were going to be read by us folks, but he says in his journals at one point that if he had faith, he would have married Regina.
Can I interrupt? That's exactly what I was trying to articulate between the monk and the existence within Christendom. Is he sort of sees his broken engagement as a move of infinite resignation, this withdrawal, monkish withdrawal from the world, which is always a temptation for him. He's always tempted by this just easy way out, essentially.
There's a bit of a so my big paper that I wrote was on something that doesn't get talked about too much, but it was what Kierkegaard calls the demonic. And the demonic is actually something that Kierkegaard thought he himself was in danger of manifesting when he chose to, write all these books, because the demonic is defined as basically willing to be yourself, willing to be yourself in spite of God is one way of putting it. So let's say, God puts it in front of you that, this it puts this girl in front of you, and then, you go through all the courting and everything, and you're going to marry her. And they're like, nah, you know what? I got this job to do, this really important job. And that is writing all these books. And if I marry you, I can't write these books. So, I mean, if that's the way you look at it, it's pretty straightforward why he said that, if I had faith, I would have married Regina. And I think he weaves, so his personality is part of every book he's written. It's always, and you think, okay, well, he writes with these other personalities, right? These personalities he made up. But I think, to be honest, I think that makes his own personality even more important, right? Because he's hiding. And if he's hiding, well, you want to know what he's hiding, right? You want to know what it is that he's actually thinking, right? If he writes with the personality of Johannes Climacus, you want to know what he thinks, not right. You're like, well, what does Johannes Climacus represent, right? Instead of you, Kierkegaard, right? If you're not writing in your own voice, what does this voice mean, right? Because you always, I don't know, I find that I'm always wondering, okay, so I see what you're doing here. I can follow along. I can read it. I can read this personality quite fine. But like, what do you think, right? So we have John the Silent, who is anything but silent, in fear and trembling, and he can't get to faith or not really, because he can't he basically can't turn off his brain, more or less. He's an intellectual. He claims to not be a philosopher at one point, but he is a philosopher, and that's the problem, right? And that's the same thing as it's the same feeling you get when you kind of understand that. You get the same feelings you get when you read him saying, "Oh yeah, you know what? If I had faith, I would have married Regina, whatever her name is." I think his personality is really important.
Yeah, that's the point I was trying to make with that analogy of I meet somebody who's just a little bit overly passionate about something, and you kind of worry they might actually do the thing that they're describing, run off and do some, kind of extravagant aesthetic experience or something. And Kierkegaard kind of is doing that. And so you're seeing the risk of it. And the risk of it is his whole life, right? The sacrifice that he made, which is a real sacrifice. Or let's put it differently. He made the wrong choice. He really did make the wrong choice. And yet that to some degree engenders the power of it,
Yep.
Yeah, it's sort of like I really think his whole writing career is sort of made possible by his breakup with Regina. It's sort of the passionate power which drives the whole authorship, it seems like.
For sure.
Robert, do you remember the analogy that I tried to put out with free solo?
Oh yeah.
In that talk with Vanderklay, do you remember that?
Yeah, was it? Yeah, we should actually get out of here and come back in because we're running out of recording minutes. So hold on.